Hey friends, Dan back for another video today, joined by special guest star Winston, who wanted to be in this video. It's a non-speaking part though, so you don't get paid, I'm afraid. Today though, we're going to be talking about storage. Now, obviously my channel is really a celebration of technology from the past, but one thing I'm very grateful for in 2021 is how affordable and ubiquitous storage is these days. I mean, the machine behind me, my main PC, has got 8 terabytes of storage in there. I've got a NAS drive in my living room with 16 terabytes on there. Even things like, you know, cheap USB sticks. This one's a 32 gig stick. I've got one in the car that's got 128 gigs on that I put all my music on for when I'm driving around. Storage is so cheap and affordable these days that we don't really give it much thought. However, wind the clock back 30 years and that wasn't the case. When the Amiga 500 came along and I got my A500 Plus for Christmas that year, the floppy disk was king. Now, bearing in mind that before I had my Amiga, I had a Commodore 8-bit machine, the Commodore Plus 4, where I used the humble cassette tape to play games and store my programs on, and then upgrading to a machine with a 3.5-inch floppy drive on it. I mean, that just felt like something from the future. These little magical square bits of plastic that could hold nearly a megabyte of information on them, you know, that felt like an infinite amount to me back then. It felt so much. So I was a big fan of the floppy disk. However, hard disks were something that I started to read more and more about. Now, I remember going into a newsagent with my dad and picking up Amiga Shopper magazine, which I used to read religiously every month, and reading about these weird things, these big disks that were called hard drives. And then I saw the prices and figured I would probably never be able to afford one. Now, hard disks weren't common at all in my friend group. In fact, I don't know anyone that had a hard disk on their Amiga until around 1995. You know, when we were at junior school, when I got my Amiga 500, getting an external hard disk for the machine was almost the same price as the computer itself. And the official Commodore drive, the A590, was retailing at £299 when I got my Amiga 500 Plus for Christmas 1991, which at the time of recording is the equivalent of around £574 today. And that is for a 20 megabyte hard disk. And that was actually one of the cheaper hard disks. There were drives like the GVP Series 2 that were £599 in 1991 money for a 50 megabyte disk. And even back then, these storage capacities didn't impress me at all. I remember Amiga games were growing in disk size by the year, and even a year after, in 1992, you had games like Monkey Island 2 that came on a massive 11 floppy disks. And if you installed that, you've used half of your hard disk capacity just on one game. Now, when you turn on a standard Amiga without a hard disk, you get the disk insert screen. And that means you can't actually do anything with the machine until you've loaded some software from disk. And most games auto-booted. So that means you just put the floppy disk in and the system will load it and boot straight into the game. The problem came when you got games that came on more and more disks. Now, a lot of Amiga users back then, including myself, had an external floppy drive, and you could pick these up for under £100. And a lot of games actually let you put one disc in the internal drive and another in the external, but not all of them. But it was quite handy to reduce disk swapping. And also having an external floppy drive was very useful for backup purposes. But by the time games like Rise of the Robots came along in 1995, it came on a whopping 15 floppy disks. What a waste of disks. And many Amiga users developed a condition known as disk swapper's wrist. Now, I didn't actually pick up a hard disk at this time. Instead, a year later, in 1992, I managed to get my hands on a CD-ROM drive for my Amiga, as I looked at it and a single CD could hold a massive 660 megabytes of storage that was way more than the biggest hard disks I was seeing in adverts that were like, you know, still 20 to 50 megs. So instead, I chose to get a CD-ROM drive. The obvious disadvantage of the CD-ROM drive is that I couldn't write to the disks. And then when the Amiga 600 was released a few months later, you could then add an internal 20 megabyte hard disk for just £100 more on the price with the HD version. But I had to wait to get one for my Amiga 500, around 25 years actually. And I finally managed to pick up an A590 hard disk just a few years ago off eBay. And here it is, the A590 hard disk for the Amiga 500 in its original box. Now, I had to move the camera back quite a bit to be able to fit this into shot, and as you can see, it's taken over quite a big chunk of my desk here. If you ordered a hard disk today and it came in a box this size, you'd assume you'd order like a pallet's worth or something, but this is a 20 megabyte hard disk for the Amiga 500 from 1991. Now, the box is a little bit beaten up. As you can see, the previous owner has put a load of packing tape all over it, but you know, it is nice to have the original packaging, even if it's just to protect the drive properly when it's not in use. So I thought we'd do a quick unboxing, if I can get into this without damaging the box, and show you what's in here. And there is actually quite a bit in this box. Now, a lot of foam there to protect the hard disk, and also we get a couple of floppy disks included as well. One of them is the A590 setup disk, which you'll need to format and partition the drive, and also there is some RAM testing software as well, which I'll get into in a bit more detail very soon. And also you get a user manual in here. Actually, it is quite a thick 61-page manual for using a hard disk. Yeah, and there's quite a lot in here, you know, information on how to set the drive up and install it and everything as well, even schematics and how to change the hard drive, and a bit at the front there as well, where you can actually write down the number of cylinders and tracks and heads on your individual drive. So yeah, cool to have the original manual. And then if we remove this top section of foam, we can see the hardware that's included in the box. Now, this drive does need its own power supply, and it is a bit of a beast. In fact, it is the same size as the Amiga 500's power supply. So, and just as heavy as well. And as you can see here, this one looks like it's melted. Now, I'm not sure whether the previous owner had something covering the vents on here that caused it to overheat and melt. It does still work, although I probably wouldn't leave this plugged in unattended. Wouldn't go out for the afternoon and leave this powered on, if I'm honest. Although, even though it looks like the Amiga 500 power supply, it is different. In fact, if you look here, it's got a round power connector as opposed to the Amiga 500 square connector. And from what I've read online, this is actually the same power supply as the Commodore 64's 1541-2 floppy drive and the CD32 console as well, I believe, just in a different case. So if you do get one of these without a power supply, it is possible that you could use one of those, but I would definitely double check that before taking my word for it. I haven't tested it out, just what I'd read on forums. So if we remove that from here, and all that's left is the A590 itself. And here it is, the 20 megabyte Amiga 500 hard disk. Now, I'll put this on the table, I'll show it in a bit more detail, and we'll get it set up. And I do think the A590 itself is actually quite a stylish looking device. Now, as you can see here, mine has actually yellowed quite a bit on the front, but the colouring is meant to be the same as the Amiga 500's beige colour. And as you can see from the look of it, it's stylized to match the design of the Amiga 500, with the grills on the back, and even the Commodore logo on the front of the drive is the same as on the old Amiga 500. And you've even got the Amiga legend there, the logo small at the front of the drive, and the two LEDs that again match the colour of the Amiga 500. So I've always thought it is quite a nice looking external device for the A500. A little bit boxy and not, you know, not as cool as something like the GVP drive, but it did have a nice appearance. And on the right side of the drive, we've got the connector to slot onto the Amiga 500's edge connector. On the back of the drive, we have a few dip switches to configure the SCSI device number, an external SCSI port there as well, which is very handy for connecting things like more hard disk drives or tape streamers, or even a CD-ROM drive you could attach to here as well. We have the round power connector there too, and as you can see on the top of the grill, there is a space there for the internal fan. Nothing on the left side of the drive, unfortunately, as some of the more high-end hard disks actually had pass-through connectors, so you could connect external peripherals like more RAM expansions or a CD-ROM drive to the side of the hard disk, which did make your Amiga 500 very wide on the desk, but unfortunately there was no pass-through on the Commodore drive. And flipping the A590 over, we can see there are a couple of information stickers on the bottom of it. One of them just showing the standard Commodore serial number information. This one at the top actually shows the drive information, revealing that this drive originally shipped with a Western Digital 20 megabyte disc that was an XT style disc, we'll talk more about in a moment. And quite interestingly, this sticker from Commodore UK, saying that this drive was checked by VT, whoever that is, on the 19th of October in 1992. Now that's quite interesting really, because I'm not sure that the A590 was even on sale at that stage. I mean, the Amiga 500 had been discontinued about 6 months earlier, and by October 92 the Amiga 1200 was on the market, so maybe this drive was like a repair that was sent back to Commodore UK and fixed under warranty. I've not seen that sticker on any other drives, so if you know, please leave a comment and tell me more. And opening the A590 Up is actually really easy. All you need to do is undo the 4 screws around the edge of the device. You've got 4 in the middle there as well, which are just to secure the hard disk in place. I'm actually missing one of those though. And then you can remove the top lid, unplugging the fan, and then you're inside. And you can see that I've got a Maxter SCSI drive inside my A590. Now this one, I believe, is an 80 megabyte drive, but it isn't the one that my device shipped with. That 20 megabyte Western Digital drive unfortunately died on me. And I've kept it around though, because actually this is quite a rare drive these days, and I just think it looks really cool. Drives of this era always had that kind of industrial look to them with their metal construction and that side-mounted drive motor and the fully exposed PCB at the bottom. And even though you might think it looks like a standard old-school IDE AT disk that you found in many computers up until the early 2000s, it's not. This is actually an IDE XT drive, and they only work with 8-bit controllers. And these weren't on the market for very long at all, actually, and they're hardly ever used. I think the biggest size that these disks ever came in was around 60 megabytes. And today, replacements for these are very hard to find, and they only manufactured them for a few years in the late 80s. So when they do come up on eBay, you're generally talking a few £100s for small, unreliable old drives. But luckily, the A590 sensibly has a SCSI interface on board as well. So thanks to a friend of mine, Steve, I actually managed to get this SCSI drive off him, an 80 megabyte drive, and this one is actually even older, from 1988, but it still works just fine. And underneath here we have the motherboard of the A590. Now, rather than taking the drive off and undoing all the shielding in true Blue Peter style, here is one I prepared earlier. Now, yeah, I do have a spare A590 board lying around. This one doesn't actually work, but you know, it is useful for spares and to show in this video as well. Now, we do have a few components on this board that I've left in. We have these 2 controller chips here. This one is a direct memory access controller that you'll also find in the CDTV and the A570 CD-ROM drive. This one, I believe, is a standard off-the-shelf SCSI controller. And you can actually see the 2 hard disk interfaces here, the XT drive interface that looks, you know, at first glance like a standard 40-pin IDE connector, but it will only work, like I said, it's an 8-bit interface. It'll only work with those quite rare drives. We have the standard SCSI controller here as well. This is where you plug the Molex cable in, you know, there's power provided from there. The fan connects here as well. And we have this area at the back of the board where you can populate it with extra RAM. And on my usual A590, the one that works, I filled this up, so we do have 2 megabytes of extra memory that are then added to the Amiga 500's total RAM. So it's cool that you can actually add extra RAM in here as well. Over here we have the firmware chips for the A590. On this one, I've got revision 6.1. Now, if you've got these ROM chips on here, unfortunately, you can only use drives up to 512K, but I've replaced them with the later revision 7 on my main A590, and I believe with that you can use disks up to 9 gigabytes. So obviously it gives you a lot more storage space than having these older ROMs in there. And I do love that the A590 has that typical Commodore engineer sense of humor that they were really into at the time. You might know that around this era, all of the Amiga computers had B-52 song lyrics as their code names, and the A590 is the same. As you can see, it's codenamed Party Mix, and there is a little jumper in the center of the board here to set the RAM configuration. You can have 2 megabytes, 1 megabyte, 512K, or if you want no memory, you put it on the amnesia setting. And the drive and power activity LEDs are named Fred and Wilma. And I love seeing little Easter eggs like this on the boards because, you know, it just proves that the Amiga engineers at the time were having so much fun in their job. And on the underside of this board, you can see I've actually made a couple of modifications to my A590. Now, it's possible to modify the drive so that you don't actually need an external power supply. And instructions for doing this are available on the net. I'll link them up in the video description, but really it's just these two jump leads that you need to connect here. And then this will actually draw power from the Amiga itself. Now, that is not advisable if you're using a standard Amiga 500 power supply. Chances are it won't be able to provide enough power. But if you are using a modified PC power supply, as I do on my Amiga 500, this is a nice little solution to mean that you don't need the external power brick. And connecting the A590 to the Amiga 500 is really straightforward. If you ever wondered what that plastic cover was for on the side of the Amiga 500, all you do is pop that off, and then in there you will see an edge connector. And then you just align the A590 and the Amiga 500 on your desk and push them together. Then connect the power supply up to the A590, which you will notice actually doesn't have a power switch on it. Instead, power cycling is taken care of by the Amiga 500, which is quite handy. But what advantages does having an A590 bring to a stock Amiga 500, and how well does this drive work 30 years after it was made? Well, we'll have a look at all that next. Now, just before we do that, I wanted to take a really quick moment to give a massive thank you to one of my regular supporters who allow me to keep making videos for you, the amazing Skillshare. Now, they are a huge online learning community where millions of people from all around the world come together to take the next step in their own creative journey. And if you join, you can take part in thousands of classes on so many different topics: marketing, design, photography, video, life improvement, and so much more, all delivered in easy to digest parts. And if you want to start your own YouTube channel, or maybe want to make videos for work, have a look at Christopher Rhodes' brilliant classes on making video on a budget. He'll tell you how to get amazing cinematic quality without breaking the bank. And speaking of which, Skillshare itself is also incredibly affordable, especially right now with lots of us still working from home. It is a really good way to learn with your extra time, and also a lot cheaper and safer than pricey in-person workshops. And you can get an annual subscription for less than $10 a month. So I want you to give Skillshare a try for yourself, and in fact the first 1,000 people who click the link in this video's description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. So claim it quick, help out the channel, thanks to our mates at Skillshare. Okay, so as mentioned, powering on the A500 with the A590 attached, both devices then spring to life. And the LEDs on the A590 are actually the same colours as the older A500 variant, with a red lamp for power and a green disk activity light. And we can also hear the rather loud fan noise coming from the device and the disc slowly spinning up. And I do mean slowly. In fact, this old SCSI drive spins up so slowly that the Amiga doesn't actually see it at first. And in fact, I need to do a quick reboot, and then the disc will start booting directly into Workbench. But this only happens when you boot up from cold. Subsequent reboots, and it works just fine. Now, the setup disk that comes with the A590 is auto-booting, and you get an old version of HD Toolbox on here as well. Now, this is where you can install and partition your hard disk, and this is where you'll go in to initially set the disk up, set the sizes, and then install the operating system. And also on the disk is an interesting program called Park. Now, this really shows the age of this drive, as all hard disks made today, and really for the last 30 years or more, are generally auto-parking. And this means that when you power off the hard disk, the read-write heads of the disk go to a safe zone away from the disk's surface. So that means if you move the drive or knock it when it's turned off, the heads are not going to move and damage the disk. But back in the 80s, you would often need to manually specify this command to move the drive heads to a safe space before powering off or moving the drive to be safe. So what you do is, each time before you powered your Amiga 500 off, you would generally run the park command, especially if you planned on dismantling the machine and moving it. Now, I've already installed and set up Workbench 1.3 on here, and all of the system files are installed on the hard disk, and in general day-to-day operation, it is so much faster and so much more convenient than trying to run the system off floppy disks. And to get the files on here, I used a combination of attaching a Gotek drive, which I'm sure you're familiar with, a floppy disk replacement device where you can actually put files onto a USB stick, and also a serial cable from my Amiga 4000 to copy files over to the A590, you know, games and apps that I've downloaded from the internet and then loaded straight onto the hard disk. Bearing in mind, this is not a big drive, so I've had to be quite selective with what I load onto here. And back in the day, a lot of Amiga games weren't actually hard disk installable, and that was really a bugbear for Amiga users because if you had friends on PCs, generally most PC games could be installed to the hard disk, but not on the Amiga. For some reason, they thought that was going to encourage piracy. But there were a few back then that did come with hard disk installers, particularly adventure games. And Loom is one of my all-time favourites, and that came with a hard disk installer, and playing it from the hard disk not only saves on all the effort of swapping disks, but also the load times of the game are a lot faster as well. And playing the game, it really does give it a much nicer pace, and not having to wait for each section of the game to load from floppy disk really does make the game flow a lot more smoothly. And of course, in more recent years, WHD Load has become the mainstay of the Amiga gaming scene, and if you're not familiar with that, it's a system that allows you to play previously floppy-only based games that didn't have hard disk installers back in the day from a hard disk. The only problem is that WHD Load doesn't work with the older Kickstart 1.3 that I've got in this early Amiga 500. But there is in fact a way, and that's by using a program called JST, which actually predates WHD Load, but has since been modified to work with WHD Load files, and, more importantly, it works with these older Amigas. And it's actually quite simple. It's just a case of running the JST command from the Amiga's command line, having copied my Kickstart ROM collection into the devs directory, and then I can run the JST executable on the WHD Load slave files, and it will then load the WHD Load game. And of course, you're running it now directly from the hard disk, no floppies, no swapping, and of course it loads a lot quicker as well. And you can even quit back to Workbench pressing F10 on the keyboard, which is very handy. And as you can see, I've actually got the full 3 megabytes in this Amiga 500, the 2 megs that I've got inside the A590, and the 512K on board, and a half meg expansion in the trapdoor. And that, for WHD Load games, is a nice amount. It means that you can play most of the games that you would have experienced on a standard 1 megabyte Amiga 500. They should load comfortably using JST. But it isn't just gaming. Having the hard disk really does bring another level to the Amiga 500 and takes it into the territory of a much more productive and usable machine. Now, all these years later, I really do understand why the magazines back in the day used to push so hard for their readers to buy hard disks, as running productivity software like the word processor Wordworth is so much easier and faster from the hard disk, rather than running it with swapping 6 floppy disks. And actually using this today, I can't believe I used to put up with running it that way when I was a kid. I mean, it's all I knew back then, but it is really nice to have all your programs installed side by side and be able to quickly swap between them. And I've even added a bunch of graphical demos to the hard disk as well, and again, much quicker than playing them off floppy disk, and it really does make the humble Amiga 500 a much more powerful and easy to use machine. Now, of course, in 2021, the A590 does seem extremely dated, even on the Amiga 500, where today we've got heaps of add-ons, you know, stuff like the ACA 500 Plus that gives you compact flashcard slots, and we have terrible fire accelerators with onboard IDE, even things like the Vampire that, you know, pushes this machine to ridiculous limits. But there is something nice about having the A590, and you can even make it a bit more modern by using things like the very cool SCSI to SD interface. And you can put this inside the A590 to give you a very nice looking SD card solution for the A500. Now, admittedly, these aren't cheap. On top of the cost of the A590, these start at around £65, but I do like the fact that you can hide them inside the A590, and I actually do use 2 of these already, one on my CDTV and one on my A3000. And admittedly, it does feel very quaint, singing the virtues of the hard disk in this era where, you know, hard disks themselves are seen as obsolete today, and we all use SSDs and M2 storage in our PCs. But being able to go back and experience something that I missed out on as a kid is really cool. I mean, I didn't get my first hard disk until I got my A1200 a good few years later. So it is great to check out the experience of the A590 and using it on a stock Amiga 500. And I've got to say, I don't think I'll be replacing this old 1988 SCSI drive in here because, you know, there is something about that whirring and the clicking and the banging of the drive itself that is a real part of the A590 experience. And just quickly before we finish up this video, if you're an Amiga fan, I don't know if you've heard about this wonderful new monthly Amiga magazine that's now onto its third issue from here in the UK, Amiga Addict. Now this comes out each month, priced at $4.99. Glossy cover, as you can see, there are interviews with people like DJ Aphrodite, who you might remember was in Amiga format back in the day. There are some wonderful features in here as well, and I love the quality. I mean, the guys have done such a good job. Lots of features, lots of articles, lots of new news about the Amiga scene, lots of retrospectives. So if you're a fan of the Amiga, definitely worth picking up. I'm actually going to be in issue number 4. I've got a column in there as well. So if you want to subscribe to this, I will put a link in this video's description. And while you're here on YouTube, here's another couple of videos I think you might enjoy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.